Gaetz, the biggest firebrand inside of the House of Representatives.
You're not taking Matt Gaetz off the board, okay? Because Matt Gaetz is an American patriot and Matt Gaetz is an American hero.
We will not continue to allow the uniparty to run this town without a fight.
I want to thank you, Matt Gaetz, for holding the line.
Matt Gaetz is a courageous man. If we had hundreds of Matt Gaetz in D.C., the country turns around. It's that simple.
He's so tough, he's so strong, he's smart, and he loves this country. Matt Gaetz.
It is the honor of my life to fight alongside each and every one of you. We will save America. It's choose your fighter time. Send in the Firebrand. Welcome back to Firebrand. We're live broadcasting out of room 2021 of the Rayburn House Office Building here at the Capitol Complex in Washington, D.C. And the devil went down to Georgia, not looking for a soul to steal, but maybe a county commission seat. That is the allegation in a recent lawsuit from Felicia Franklin, who was the vice chair of the Clayton County Board of County Commissioners. She was running for chair to lead that local government when she had an unfortunate encounter with law enforcement. Watch.
Ma'am, did you want to pick her up by the arm?
The woman you just saw having the mother of all episodes is Clayton County Commissioner Felicia Franklin. What appears to be a wild night out gone wrong, however, could turn out to be far more complicated once she's coherent enough to share her version of how everything went off the rails. But regardless of how she got to this point, the consequences Felicia will ultimately face will not be fun.
Gene on Rumble says, now I know what the devil looks like. So the allegation here is that this county commissioner was somehow given the date rape drug rather than the 5 drinks that witnesses indicate that she had had at a nearby sports bar that she was found outside of. But now she is suing, claiming institutional racism for how she was treated by those healthcare professionals who were there to help her. So always interesting to check in on what is going on in the state just north of mine in Georgia. That is apparently the state of your local government. From that to global government, we have increasing concerns about what is being taught to students in Gaza and in other areas where the United Nations is really pushing a curriculum that drives incitement. And if there is any hope for a Middle East without this type of intergenerational conflict and hatred, you've got to break that cycle with young children, with minds that are not somehow lashed to all of these historical grievances and religious strife. And we're not really achieving that. The UN schools that exist in Gaza, in parts of Judea and Samaria, are part of the problem. And the best evidence for that is what you hear directly from the young people who are attending those schools. Listen to these really troubling, hateful pronouncements from children directly as a result of the flow of your tax dollars to the UN to this very hate. Take a listen.
We have to make war to prove that we are stronger than the Jews. People love Palestine, and they are ready to die for Palestine. I want to fight the Jews and defeat them in war. At school, they teach us that Al-Aqsa and all of Palestine is ours. The Jews lie and say their temple is under the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It was never there. I hate the Jews. Yes, they teach us that the Zionists are our enemy and must fight them. They teach us that Jews are terrorists. At school, they teach us about Jews. They teach us that they are bad people. I am ready to stab a Jew and drive a car over them. I will fight. I will ram a car into them. We have to constantly stab them, drive over them, and shoot them. Stabbing and running over Jews brings dignity to the Palestinians. I am prepared to be a suicide bomber. With Allah's help, I will fight for ISIS, the Islamic State.
We're back live, and many of you on the live stream are just as concerned and saddened by this as we all are. A lot of calls to defund the UN. Annie on Facebook calling for a U.S. withdrawal of all participation in UN programs. Star Traveler saying we need to disband the UN. Look, it would disband if we just stopped paying for it. If it wasn't the U.S. being the world's piggy bank and dead money, probably the UN would have a very different shake. So when we see children, like out of the mouth of babes, expressing this violent hate, this desire to harm and kill and even die, you really start to see how grave the challenge is and how much the calls for the UN and international involvement and globalist institutions have really failed the people there and likely will lead to even more years of death and strife. We continue with our coverage of international events and how people are reflecting on them. And this brings us to some reporting that we got out of the One America News Network, OAN. Now, OAN's chief White House correspondent, Chanel Rion, committed an act of felony wrongthink recently when she tweeted a link to a State Department memo concerning election fraud in Ukraine. And she compared that obviously to the standards that we would think that we hold here in the United States of America. But not living up to our own standards is nothing new. And there is hypocrisy in condemning other countries while simultaneously we fail to meet the bar that we set for ourselves. It's cognitive dissonance. Now, this was in 2004, so some of us remember how American elections were run back then. We were still fresh off of the hanging chads and dimpled chads from the 2000 Bush v. Gore election, and we had work to do. We had work to do at the state level in Florida to ensure we had paper ballots, the ability to audit, check, recount with sophistication, but not so much so that we were overly reliant on technologies that we weren't sure we could entirely control. So let's look at what 2004 Ukraine and 2020 United States have had in common. So the illegal use of absentee ballots, election observers ejected from polling stations, abnormally high turnout that doesn't match any voter roll voting machines, potentially having a lack of clarity regarding whether or not they were connected to the internet or otherwise vulnerable to any type of manipulation. It was, in fact, Democrat U.S. senators who signed letters saying that they were really concerned about these Dominion Smartmatic machines. So the report that Chanel Rion is talking about could similarly indict like the state of Georgia alongside the government of Ukraine. Every one of these critiques was present in the 2020 election. If you so much as mentioned concern about the election or evidence we were observing, you were kicked off of social media and branded a conspiracy theorist. Now you've got Zelensky in Ukraine actually disbanding political parties, canceling elections. Funny how that works. Losing confidence in the republic, the democratic process, elections, this is a bad sign for any country. And as you can see with the current situation in Ukraine, things can devolve quickly. Possibly the eeriest line in this report that Chanel Rion shared is straight from the American ambassador himself. He says, quote, Let me say again that the U.S. wants to see Ukraine develop as a secure, independent, democratic, and economically prosperous country that increasingly draws closer to the European and Euro-Atlantic institutions. It's a national embarrassment that we're not holding elections indistinguishable from corrupt, budding Slavic democracies. Things have to change. High-trust countries are fragile, and they are a privilege. And without trust in free and fair elections undergirded by actual election integrity, who knows what situation we may find ourselves in the next 20 years. There's a moment in a congressional hearing I want to draw your attention to as well during the program today. This comes from Congressman Clay Higgins of Louisiana. He had the opportunity to question FBI Director Christopher Wray regarding January 6th. This clip caught my eye. Take a listen.
If you are asking whether the violence at the Capitol on January 6th was part of some operation orchestrated by FBI sources and or agents, the answer is emphatically
You're saying
not.
no?
No.
You're saying no?
Not
Okay.
violence orchestrated
Let's
by
move
FBI
on.
sources or agents.
Are you familiar with you know what a ghost vehicle is? Director of the FBI certainly should. You know what a ghost bus is?
A ghost bus?
Ghost bus.
I'm not sure I've used that term before.
Okay. Well, it's pretty common in law enforcement. It's a vehicle that's used for secret purposes. It's painted over. These two buses in the middle here, they were the first to arrive at Union Station on January 6th, 0500. I have all this evidence. I'm showing you a tip of this iceberg.
Mr. Chairman.
These two buses
Mr.
are
Chairman.
painted completely white.
Point of order.
This is a very significant hearing, Mr. Chairman, and these buses are nefarious in nature and were filled with FBI informants dressed as Trump supporters and deployed onto our Capitol on January 6th. Your day is coming, Mr. Ray.
Mr.
We are back live. Clay Higgins always bringing it, asking the tough questions. We are still on that investigation. There is a sentiment on the live stream from some I want to address. Tired on Rumble saying, motion to vacate Mike Johnson. He screwed us over. Butch on Getter says, time to vacate Johnson. Well, that's not going to happen before we give him like his first month. If Mike Johnson continues to govern by continuing resolution without a sincere commitment to our single subject spending bills, then he will likely face the same fate as Kevin McCarthy. This is about the work, not the person, and the work has to be done. Now, Kevin McCarthy had 7 months and produced one single subject spending bill and then sent us all on like a 7-week vacation. Mike Johnson has moved these bills and admittedly passed a continuing resolution that I opposed, that 95 Republicans opposed. But keep in mind, whether you like it or don't, and I don't, a majority of Republicans voted for that CR. So this wasn't something that Mike Johnson, forced down everyone's throat. You had a majority of the majority backing this piece of crap legislation that didn't provide wins for the people in this country, that extended the spending of Joe Biden and the policies of Nancy Pelosi. So what Mike Johnson has done here has bought himself tens of days, I think 74 days remaining. And in that time period, we have to pick the fights and deliver the wins on the border, on spending cuts, and defanging this weaponized government. And it's not going to be easy because we don't exactly have like the 300 in the Republican conference. You just watched Republicans work with Democrats so that we didn't impeach Mayorkas. That was wrong. They were wrong. We should have impeached Mayorkas. But you are seeing something. That this might not be the Republican fighting force that all of us would have hoped, but we got to go to war with the army we have, not the army we want. And when I went to try to get the FBI headquarters, the brand new building larger than the Pentagon, out of the budget, prohibited from being constructed, 70 Republicans voted with the Democrats and the FBI. So we are going to hold Speaker Johnson to account on spending reductions, the border, and doing everything we can to defang this government. But keep in mind, he is the speaker, not the dictator. And if you've got a lot of these so-called Republican members working with the Democrats on these things, it's going to be very difficult. This continuing resolution was not the right approach. It was not the right first step. I strongly advised against it. I voted against it. But now we have tens of days to deliver on the real stuff we got to do on the border. Not Ukraine's border, our border. And that'll be the fight where I'll need all of you to try to put some sort of courage and rigor into the Republican effort that I think has been rightly critiqued as lackluster to date. One thing that I wanted to have as a centerpiece of this report to you is a growing concern I have about what's going on in the sky. You don't have a choice when you participate in air travel in the United States as to the quality of your air traffic controller. There's not like an option for you to say, I'll pay extra to make sure that the people directing my plane into the airport are competent and capable and trained. You get whoever the government put there. And increasingly, that is leading to very dangerous skies. There was a report that concerned me greatly that I read at revolver.news. You'll know Dr. Darren Beattie is the publisher of that website. He joined me moments ago to talk about crash landing, and we should all be concerned about DEI in the skies. Take a listen. We are joined now by one of Firebrand's favorite guests, Dr. Darren Beattie. He is the publisher of Revolver News, which you can find at revolver.news. And recently I was reading an incredible investigative report styled Crash Landing, the inside scoop about how COVID and affirmative action policy gutted aviation safety. And after I read this piece at revolver.news, I turned over to my wife and said, I never want to fly in an airplane in the United States of America again. Dr. Beattie, I want to get into the causalities in a moment. But before that, how would you describe the current state of aviation safety? How dangerous has this become?
Well, it's a complex because on one hand, we've gone a very, very long time without a major catastrophic commercial aviation disaster. So that's one part of the equation. But the other part of the equation, which we address in this comprehensive and very in-depth piece, is that the number of close calls, events that aviation professionals call runway incursions, where two airplanes almost collide into each other on the runway, or what they call loss of separation events in the air, near mid-air collisions, both of which as a result of air traffic control error. These incidents have skyrocketed and in fact have doubled in the past decade. So on the one hand, we don't have any catastrophic accident, but on the other hand, the close calls are multiplying and doubling over the past decade. And in recent months, there have been just a series of absolutely incredible close calls in the Austin airport and other airports across the country of just really shocking incompetence displayed by our air traffic control professionals.
And the pilots seem to know it. You talk about the dangers in Austin, Texas, and I think you even quoted one of the pilots in the piece who said they're trying to kill us in Austin.
Exactly. The pilots saying they're trying to kill us. And the thing is, there's like an implicit hierarchy. There's a chain of command. You're supposed to listen to the air traffic controllers, but the confidence that the pilots have in the air traffic controllers is absolutely diminishing, and justifiably so, because of this series of near catastrophes that have resulted directly and very starkly from egregious and almost unfathomable incompetence from air traffic controllers. And
it's human error.
Yeah.
It's human error. Like when we think about a near miss or a loss of separation, it's not that there was some bug or glitch in the system. This doubling of the error rate, you have been able to directly tie to the actual human beings that operate these systems, right?
Yeah, well, it's human beings in two sense. There's quantity and quality. The COVID hiring freezes dramatically impacted the quantity. Now, we've spoken to a number of aviation professionals, a number of FAA officials, former spokespeople, the whole range. Very few wanted to speak about it at all. Still, a few more said, okay, we'll talk about background. We got one former spokesman called McCormick, who was willing to answer some questions, but the level of obfuscation and really delusion was quite remarkable. But we did get him to admit that COVID hiring freezes played a dramatic role in the understaffing epidemic in the air traffic control profession. Long time ago, we've spoken about this on Firebrand. Revolver did a major investigative piece using the life years metric as a means of analyzing whether the lockdown policies made sense. Well, we didn't even take into account the fact that these unnecessary hiring freezes due to COVID could have resulted in, the next major aviation disaster. The spokesperson was much more tight-lipped and I would say deceptive maybe when it comes to acknowledging the role of the vaccine mandates in particular. But even if we set those aside, simply the effect of the hiring freezes, I think, is alone to really further condemn the COVID hysteria, which, we're still feeling the ramifications of that. So that's for the quantity. As for the quality, we trace a lot of the diminution of quality to pretty dramatic changes that were put in place by the Obama administration, effectively to court more diversity. They entirely dispensed with the merit-based test that was sort of like an SAT, but for air traffic controllers. They got rid of that entirely in favor of a test that gauges what they call biodata, which is a huge scam. We track its source to this woman who's a professor of HR, believe it or not, that actually exists.
Wow.
Entire dissertation, she was sort of spearheaded this. Her entire dissertation was on how to use biodata scam in order to basically increase diversity in hiring practices. And so that's what we get. And the pilots that we spoke to and aviation professionals pretty much all said, yes, this has led to a discernible and conspicuous decline in quality from what we had before.
It is a perfect storm of danger because on one hand, whether it was the vax mandates, whether it was the hiring freeze, or frankly, whether it was just the cultural adoption of working from home, it hollowed out all this experience that we had. These experienced air traffic controllers would leave for one reason or another, and then the backfill are all these DEI hires who didn't have to do the rigorous merit-based testing.
Exactly.
I read this, and I am wondering why there is not a long line of whistleblowers coming to Congress, going to the Aviation Committee to express their concern. I mean, you detail in the piece how reticent people were to speak candidly with you about this. Why aren't more people sounding the alarm?
Well, it's unfashionable and it's career death for many. They have benefits, they have their careers on the line for this, and nobody really wants to hear it because by now it's a very systemic problem, and it takes a long time actually to train air traffic controllers. That's the other side of it. For the understaffing is there was the COVID hiring freeze, but then there was also a massive surge in retirements as a result, in the COVID era. Now they could pretend like that has nothing to do with the vaccine mandates, but I think given the available evidence, and there were studies of pilots were extremely reluctant to take the vaccine in numbers that were significant. Attribute any reason you want, but there was a marked increase of retirements as a result of the COVID policies enacted, in addition to the hiring freezes. So it's kind of cutting it from both sides there. And as you point out, the ones that remain very, very low quality, hired on the basis of these new, effectively, diversity mandates. And just to give you a sense of how absurd it is, we opened the piece with one of the most egregious near accidents, the runway incursion, they call it, of a Southwest plane that almost ran into a FedEx plane. And the air traffic controller who's responsible for this, and this isn't just like, oh, this is super complicated, but he made a mistake, but it's like, no, this is very, very avoidable mistakes. It's extreme incompetence. This guy went back to the air traffic control just weeks later.
Wow.
He's back on the job.
And in a lot of ways, we want to advocate for the empowered consumer, right? Don't buy food that's bad for you. Look at it, observe the labels. Don't, go to media outlets that are trying to poison you. Make sure that you're understanding the biases and the sourcing. But like when it comes to an empowered consumer in aviation, what are you supposed to do? Because it doesn't matter what airline you're on, you're all landing on the same runways, right?
That's a fantastic point, and it gets to sort of the more, I guess, philosophical or contextual side of the story. We contextualize this report in terms of what we call the collapse of our ability to maintain complex systems. Now, you have a lot of people, technologists, people like Peter Thiel, who've publicly lamented the lack of innovation in our economy outside of technology. But this underscores how bad things really are. Forget about innovation. We're not even able to maintain, let alone innovate. The complex systems like aviation, like electric grid, transportation, there are a number of different systems that depend not necessarily on geniuses to keep it running, but to competent, responsible professionals with institutional knowledge. And our system breaks down at the point of being able to pass down that institutional knowledge to the next generation of competent professionals. And we see that in the aviation industry. Revolver has addressed this general issue way back remember when the Texas power grid was having issues. I mean, ultimately, this results in a South Africa type situation. Now, to get back to the aviation example, which I think is the most shocking because, air traffic disasters really kind of seize us on a visceral level in terms of how terrifying they are. You point out there's no way to get around this. And normally the answer to the collapse of these complex systems is, okay, have the tragedy of the commons. Every common space is sort of gutted and devolves into the lowest common denominator. The very wealthy in society, the ruling elite, are the diminishing numbers of them, but they're able to kind of buy their way out of it. The interesting thing about the aviation example is even if you fly private, you're not able to buy your way out of it because the problems with the air traffic controllers. And in fact, some of the examples that we've given, several actually involve private aircraft. So interestingly, it's one of these things that even the ruling class isn't able to buy their way out of unless they start to just operate out of entirely different airports. But even then, they're dependent on air traffic coordination with the plebs and their commercial aircraft. So it's really quite remarkable in that respect that it's not even one of those things that, if it were an airline issue, say, okay, we're left with crappy pilots, crappy flying experience, all the rich people flying private. But for this particular issue, there's no buying your way out of it.
No, it's a fully integrated system. There's no way to tier it out for people that have the resources to basically buy their way out of these safety and danger problems. I want to end with this. You talk about solutions in the piece, and you essentially say throw the baby out with the bathwater, that the public sector, government-funded air traffic control system is unsavable, and that you believe privatization is something that needs to be seriously considered in order to raise the level of competence. Have I overstated how stark you think the options are for us going forward?
No, I think that needs to be seriously looked into. And my understanding is President Trump actually suggested something along these lines, although I'm not sure if he seriously pursued it. But I think that's something to look into aggressively. But ultimately, the issue is, even when you go private, a lot of these laws and pressures remain in terms of the diversity aspect. And we've covered this independently in a discussion of sort of the implications of certain areas of civil rights law. For instance, disparate impact law means that any kind of test that leads to a differential impact across racial or gender lines that doesn't correspond exactly with the distribution of the population, any such test for an employer is considered to be presumptively illegal on the basis of disparate impact. So that's a civil rights law that applies to the private sector as well. And so you can't really avoid the underlying pressures even by going private. And the remarkable thing is, you'd think, okay, there's this diversity imperative that exists within our society. It's effectively the ideology of the American empire. But you would hope there would at least be enough sense to say, okay, let's get the diversity hires and have that maybe in the commercials or in areas that are not ultra critical. But the fact that we've gotten to the point where we're doing that to the air traffic control indicates that there's a level of insanity and recklessness that really defies the notion that there's something kind of cynical and strategic about the diversity thing. Like, it's just superficial, it's just for show, but we still can make the trains run on time. This is about as trains run on time as you can possibly get, is making sure the aviation industry works without catastrophic disaster. And even that has been compromised, which kind of tells us how crazy things have gotten.
I miss the simpler days when what I had to worry about most on commercial air travel was bad turbulence, bad weather, or bad passengers. Now those all fall below the list. Crash landing, the inside scoop about how COVID and affirmative action policy gutted aviation safety. That's the piece. Go ahead, Darren.
One more thing. As far as solutions, this isn't going to be a long-term solution, but something that's worth considering. There is technology that can compensate to a large degree for the incompetence of the air traffic personnel. And not all of our airports have this technology. And the FAA has said that this is a result of a lack of funding and all these things. So,
I'm sure there'll be a government contractor who will say that because of the COVID laws that we passed and the corresponding DEI that we backfilled it with, we now need to go spend a bunch of taxpayer money to create a technology system to overlay the human incompetence. Is that where this all goes?
They're already saying that. And so, but assuming that there is technology that works, it's pretty amazing that we've directed $100 billion to Ukraine, and yet we have airports that lack what the FAA is describing as critical technology to avoid the next aviation disaster. So it's just incompetence and corruption piled on top of each other, up to the stratosphere.
Oh, yeah, sure. Before it's all over, they'll say we actually need to give the money to Ukraine so that we can then glean and learn how to better keep our own skies safe. But that will, of course, be nonsense. Revolver.news is the website. Dr. Darren J. Beattie is the publisher. Follow him at Darren J. Beattie on most social media platforms, right?
Indeed. On Twitter, it's at Darren J. Beattie.
All right, great. And Revolver.news, make sure you are a daily reader, as I am. Thanks so much, Dr. Beattie.
Thank you.